So in this video, we're gonna go over the pros and cons of taxis in New York City specifically. Now, yes, taxis do still exist in New York City. They are not extinct, not yet at least. So I honestly do think there are pros to taxis in New York City, and there are some cons as well. So we're gonna go over them today in this video. Now, the pros to taxis in New York City is honestly the biggest one is going to be the price. Now, it used to be that Uber, Lyft, and some of these other rideshare companies in New York City were decently affordable to get around New York City, and that's definitely not the case anymore. So taxis know that they're pretty much always beating their competitors on price. Now, it's not always the case, but for, I would say, over 75% of the time, whenever I take a taxi, it's going to be cheaper than if I took an Uber, Lyft, or any other car service. So that's going to be the biggest pro of taxis. Now, also, strangely enough, another pro sometimes of taxis is that Uber, Lyft, and these other rideshare companies sometimes have just such high demand that there has been times that it's actually been easier for me to hail a cab than it has been for me to wait around for a Lyft or an Uber to get to me. Because sometimes the waiting times could be like well over 10 minutes, depending on where you are and what time of day it is and what the demand is. So I actually think that sometimes it's easier to get a cab. So weirdly enough, you would think that these rideshare companies would always be easier, but with demand being so high nowadays, sometimes it's just easier, depending on if you're in a high traffic neighborhood, to just go outside and just get a cab yourself. So that's gonna be the pros of cabs. Now, another pro of cabs is that you know that like the car that you're going into is a professionally used car, it's a taxi. So it's not just like someone's like random car that they own. And with Uber and Lyft, it's ride sharing and you're using someone's car that they probably use on a regular basis as just like their actual personal car, most likely. So I have been in some rideshare cars that have been like a crime scene in New York City. Like literally they look like they're straight out of a crime scene movie. Like that's how bad these Uber and Lyft cars were. Like I couldn't even believe that it was like okay for these drivers to be on that app with that car. So there's been points of my journey in New York City that I've actually tried to avoid using those apps because for a while, like for a couple months in a row, I was getting the worst cars like I've ever seen in my life. And I was just like, oh my gosh, I need to go with these cars that I know that are gonna be decent when I go inside because they're used for a professional reason. So I would say that that's also another pro is like, you're getting a taxi, you know it's a taxi cab. It's not gonna be someone's random car and it's like some alleyway in Queens for like, I don't know, 10 years. So those are gonna be the major pros of taxis. Now, when you look at the cons, especially compared to rideshare, is that you're not always gonna be able to hail a taxi, especially if it's late at night or you're in a neighborhood where there's not a lot of cars that come through that neighborhood. So it's pretty easy to hail a taxi in Midtown. However, I live in Battery Park City. This neighborhood is a great example for this. There's not a ton of taxis that are going through Battery Park City at all times of the day. Now, they do exist over there. They do come through the neighborhood, but at the same time, it's not gonna be the same as it's gonna be in Midtown. So me trying to hail a cab outside of my Battery Park City apartment is definitely not the easiest thing. I have done it before, but it's kind of like a getting lucky situation because you're just not gonna have a ton of taxis going through there. So I definitely have to rely on the car services more than anything else there because I know that the car service has to come pick me up when I request the ride. So that is a con, is that if you're in a place where it's just not as easy to get a cab or it's late at night, good luck getting a cab because it could, just depending on where you are, it could just be really hard or impossible to do. So that's gonna be the biggest con. Now, also just convenience of being able to go on your phone and know that like your car is gonna be here in 2 minutes, 3 minutes, or however long it's gonna take, or maybe just like right then and there, like instantly. So with a cab, you're not gonna be able to have that. However, there is an app for taxi cabs. So they are trying to kind of compete with the rideshare space a little bit more. The name of the taxi app is Curb, that is used here in New York City. So that is basically the same idea. However, there's not a lot of taxis on the app, and sometimes it can be really, really glitchy and just not work at all. But I have used the app before and have had some successful rides with the app. But when it comes to overall experience with speed and efficiency, so I guess I would say that the ride shares typically win in that category just because you can instantly book a ride. So surprisingly, there are times when I do recommend using a cab in New York City if you can, because they're definitely gonna be more affordable. And sometimes it's just honestly a better experience. So there's a lot of times where I would prefer to use a taxi if I think it's the right situation for where I'm going or what I'm doing at that moment. So I hope this video helped you, and I hope it also helped you kind of take a new look at taxis in New York City, because they're not dead, they're still around. And honestly, I do think there is still some demand for them, and I do prefer taking them at times. So if you have any comments or anything else to add about taxis in New York City, just leave it in the comments. I would love to hear from you guys.